All right, welcome back. This is part 4 of our deep dive on Adobe, where we are going through the entire business to try to learn it end to end. To date, we've covered the business model, the fundamentals, looking at the financial statements and some valuation metrics, as well as looking at the moat and how Adobe competes in the marketplace. Today, we're going to be looking at, I think, the most interesting and possibly the most important section in this entire analysis, and that is the threats and the opportunities that Adobe is facing in the marketplace because of AI, because of competitors like Canva. This is a super rich discussion. So we're going to be going into the 3 biggest threats that I see, how Adobe's moat might allow them to compete against those threats, and even how those might become opportunities. Couple things before we get started. First, this is not financial advice whatsoever. This is a learning exercise to dive into the business and try to understand it. It is an interesting conversation because at the time of filming, the stock is between 240 and 220, which is considerably down over the year. But this is mostly academic, and I'm just sharing how I'm thinking about it as a CPA and senior financial analyst. I will also say that when you're watching this, the price might be different. And not only that, but the entire business landscape and what the business actually is might be different as well. So take that into account when you're watching this. And the final thing is that most of this analysis was done based on FY25 data. At the time of filming, Q1 of FY26 has been released, but I prefer to look at the business from an entire operating period perspective and then work in information from the Q1 release as needed to update our understanding rather than base the foundational understanding on that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so the centerpiece of the discussion and what's happening right now surrounding Adobe is, of course, AI and the competition that comes with it. What's really happened over the last few years is because of social media, we've seen this demand side explosion for content, both from brands and from individual creators and just individuals themselves. There really seems to be like an unquenchable thirst for content. And controversially or not, AI seems to be a potential solution to that. And because of that, I think we're seeing a massive influx of capital investing in technologies that are able to fulfill that need. And the thesis is really that professional grade creative output no longer requires professional level tools. We can just describe to AI the type of content we want to see. It can create it for us, whether we're a business or an individual, and we will just consume that, I guess. Or it can help us create, human-made content as well. And so basically, we are seeing many new competitors that Adobe didn't face several years ago. There is the obvious competitive tools like Canva, and they've recently acquired Affinity, and they're making that free with some freemium tools that you can upgrade with. There is obviously ChatGPT and Gemini that can create pretty amazing images with just text. And then at the time of filming, Anthropic has just released Claude Design, which I think is really interesting because it's sort of like a combination where you describe what you want and you get your output, and then it has these features built within it where you can sort of just touch it up. And then there's obviously the other creative VC funded tools, I would call them, that have similar capabilities and are also a threat. So I think that's really the basis of what's happening, but let's go a lot deeper here. So for me, I can sort of take away 3 key threats from this increased competition. The first, I would say, is low-end erosion. So really what we're talking about here is those low-end customers are hobbyists, freelance artists, and the non-creative students that really don't have power user needs. And we've sort of talked about it already, but the risk here is that good enough is good enough, and that bar can be met by AI tools or some light editing tools like Canva or Affinity offers, but they don't need the powerful ecosystem of Adobe. Again, I think for any student, for example, going to Gemini and getting this for free for a vanilla ice cream brand or something is completely fine under every situation, right? So the risk we're really talking about here is that this customer base doesn't renew, they're already on it, that's what it assumes, and then that new customers don't sign up. They just go to some of these other brands that are cheaper or free. Now, one thing I just want to touch on here is that I was really tempted to try to back calculate how much of Adobe's revenue comes from individual consumers, but I think it's wrong, and I just want to warn you before you go and do it. So you can sort of try to back calculate it because you have business and professional revenue and consumer revenue in FY24 as 5.6 billion, right? And if you look at the financial statements, the Document Cloud is Adobe Acrobat, Adobe Acrobat Sign, Adobe Acrobat Scan, all of the Acrobat services. And then in the more recent financial statements, you'll see that the business, professional, and consumers consist of Adobe Acrobat. So, you can think, okay, I'll just remove the reported Document Cloud amount of 3.1, and that will get me the consumer revenue, right? That would be the part of the revenue at risk of leaving because of AI. And that would only be, 11.5% of total revenue. So, it's a lot of money. It would be bad to lose that, but it's not gonna end Adobe. That being said, this is not correct. Going back to the notes of the financial statements, you'll also note that the consumer customer group consists of Adobe Express. So it's not the same thing as saying that individual consumers on Creative Cloud are part of that consumer group. They're only counting Express users as consumers. If you are signed up for Creative Cloud, they consider you a professional. I think to estimate that it's 12% would be highly inaccurate, and I think truthfully we just have to admit that Adobe doesn't give us the clarity to know how much is at risk because of AI. And that itself should go into your valuation. When you put a price on the company, you have to admit that there are things that you don't know, and there's risk involved in that. So anyway, I think we can sort of think about Adobe's moat now and how it might protect them from that risk. The first thing that I think we've sort of already talked about a little bit, but Canva's been around for a long time. I remember using it back when I was in university, which was quite a long time ago now. So it's already been the cheap or free alternative to the low-end user, and I don't really think there would be that many of them left. Adobe does claim that they are competing neck and neck, and they say that they're growing 25% year over year in their low-end tools, but of course they include Acrobat in this for some reason, so it's hard to parse that out. Really, my take on this threat is that they don't have a great way of competing with Canva, or they've sort of already lost the low-end battle, I would say, but that also means that AI is not a current risk to them, right? So I think it's sort of like bad news, but good news at the same time that way. Now, of course, new technologies like this are also opportunities. They're not just threats. So if you go and you listen to some of Adobe's most recent investor conferences, they do have discussions on this. So they see strategies and opportunities around AI, and they feel that by integrating some of the leading AI tools in Express and Adobe Acrobat, so you can ask your PDF questions in a chat window, they're going to be able to use those tools as essentially a freemium, purchase credit packages type model, which they can then convert into some of the high use customers for Creative Cloud who actually do need more powerful tools, but run into the paywalls of Express when they're using the app. Again, we'll probably come back to this slide quite a lot over the next couple videos because I think it's really useful for understanding how Adobe is looking at the business in the AI world. But again, they really see Adobe and Acrobat as a top of funnel tool, which they can then feed into the other applications that they make a lot more of their money on. And you might want to just pause it and read this. I apologize that it's a little bit blurry. It's just a screenshot from a webcast that they had. But they have a lot of offerings that they're thinking of bringing to individuals who use their apps, which they can provide value through. I think it's cool to integrate conversational interfaces and agents in some of their tools, and they're building MCP endpoints in a lot of these apps so that agents can go in and use Photoshop as a tool itself, and that might be a whole new revenue surface for Adobe. So ultimately, if this pans out, this is probably TAM growth. It's making creativity more accessible to more people. They create more, they use more of Adobe, and the entire market that Adobe targets gets bigger, and that allows for a lot more space for growth. I agree that this is a big opportunity for them, but the risk here is execution, not the technology. The question is, if we have this whole new market that is able to be taken by businesses, is Adobe the one who's able to grab most of it, or does it get taken by Canva or some other app? I don't really know, to be honest. I think they would say that they're doing it because they're seeing this massive 25% year-over-year growth, Firefly monthly active users growing 30% quarter-over-quarter, and AI influenced revenue almost doubling. But to be honest, I don't really know what AI influenced means. I think that they're sort of making that definition up on the fly. And I also think that you should go and test it out yourself. Test out Adobe Express, test out Canva, test out ChatGPT. What do you like more? To be honest with you, when I've gone to do this, I think that Express is the worst user experience out of all of them by far. It was not a good experience. Going there, trying to create this image of vanilla ice cream, those little things add up, and being a smooth user experience matters for whether or not they're able to execute on this opportunity and actually take advantage of it. I'll also add here that I think it's really interesting that they're putting their document business, Adobe Acrobat, in the free part of their offering. They don't see it as one of these core money makers in the post-AI world. And they don't say this explicitly. They say that they see productivity and creativity merging into one thing. I don't really know what that means either. But I think the more cynical view is that they don't feel they have a lasting competitive advantage in document workflows. Why would I open my PDF up in Acrobat to read it or ask it questions if they have AI integration when I can upload it into Copilot and it is in theory a lot more capable of an AI? I don't know, but I think it's interesting that they're making it part of their freemium top of offer feature rather than leaning into it as a core moneymaker. And don't forget, in 2024, Document Cloud revenue, which is that service, was still $3.2 billion worth of their revenue, right? That's not an insignificant amount of money. Okay, so risk number 2 is what I call platform displacement risk. This is where high-end creative work shifts away from Adobe at the professional and enterprise level, not at the consumer and individual level. This is the tier where your product cannot be good enough. It needs to be pixel perfect, it needs to be targeted towards a specific customer, and it needs to be in sync with brand guidelines. And there's not really an alternative right now for this market, but if you believe that it's a true risk to Adobe, you're assuming that in the near future, Claude Design or some other tool gets good enough that they're able to make basically like picture perfect content, and it's good enough that just adjusting it on the slider is good enough for corporate purposes. And then sort of like the level 2 risk on top of that is that professional and creative workers, either via agencies or in-house, are just fully automated and no longer required. And this is really like the whole AI replaces all knowledge work theory, which I think is like a massive claim and almost like too big to even understand and digest what that even means in the first place. But I don't really want to talk about it too much. I think if this occurs, you have to believe that agents are able to basically fully replace workers on a technical level. The compute build out happens way faster than anyone is expecting because at current costs, it's just too expensive. There's no way AI agents could economically replace, I think, what people bring. And then even in that case, with Adobe creating MCP endpoints for their tools, AI agents wouldn't even need tools under this scenario. I think they can just sort of like manifest the results. So I think Adobe is honestly quite protected from this scenario. First of all, I don't think the quality for AI tools is even close to being there yet. You definitely still need to make a lot of changes if you want it to be perfect. You can go and test this for yourself. And as long as you still need to touch things up, the professionals are still gonna want to use Adobe because of the massive switching costs that we discussed in the last episode of moving away. It's the tool that they're comfortable in and want to keep using it. Second, even if the capability was there for AI, if you think about what makes creative content good, it's really like originality. And I think if everyone is using the same AI model essentially for creative output, I don't know where that originality comes from. Again, I'm not an expert here. Like, I'm talking based on the research that I've done, but I don't have like real personal experience in this. That being said, I watched this video as part of my research, which for some reason is not loading right now. So I'll throw the video up on screen while I'm editing. But it made a really good point that when you look at Claude Design, all these videos on YouTube have this like crown in them, And like, why is that? I think it's because they're all just using AI to make their thumbnails. And no one really is standing out here because it's all the exact same. There's no differentiation because the AI is coming up with the same idea for everybody. So I still just kind of feel in my soul that humans will bring more originality than AI will, even if the capabilities get really good. And then the third thing, which we'll talk about again in later videos as well, but I think we can look to fields that are farther ahead than creative for what AI will do to those industries. And the one that's the farthest ahead right now is obviously coding and software engineering. And from what I've heard, what's happening is that with lower barriers of entry, the realm of what's possible is expanding, but that's really just shifting the bottleneck to needing more seniors with experience who are able to review the code in a timely manner, fix the bugs, and touch up the things that AI gets wrong. And that's basically what we just talked about for creative work, right? Like the ability to create thousands, tens of thousands more content for a marketing campaign shifts the bottleneck to managing all of those assets, those campaigns, and that customer data across all the different advertising platforms of Google and Meta and whatever else there is. And this is exactly what Adobe discusses in the content that they put out for marketers. Instead of having a 200 asset campaign, you might have a 200,000 asset campaign with hyper-specific ads for extremely niche customer segments. So you can use Adobe's products to train an AI based on your brand values and your brand guidelines. You can create the content there, you can touch it up there, and then it's all connected as part of their software ecosystem. Then you can launch and manage the campaign and review all the analytics all in one workflow essentially. And that is what Adobe is offering with their digital experience suite. And then again, I'm not gonna touch on the AI replacing workers narrative too much here, but they were basically asked it directly on their last investor conference. And this is the CFO here. And what he's talking about is that if their software and those agents are so good that the workflows save enough time that you don't even need people anymore in the business, the economic logic is that as long as Adobe continues to enable the business to do more faster, they have justification to negotiate fees. They're providing more value and they can request higher pricing in return. That's basic economic logic, and it's just something I'm personally not that worried about for the company, assuming they're able to execute on the AI opportunity. Now, executing on those key opportunities, I think is really interesting to discuss Adobe's brand power. We talked about in the second video in this series how Adobe has a strong brand of reliability and relationships and trust with its customers already. And if you follow the news, recently Disney canceled this $1 billion deal with OpenAI because they had the platform of Sora, which was able to generate AI video content, and Disney wanted to use it for whatever its purposes were, but OpenAI shut it down. And this is an expensive process for Disney to go through, right? They went through the process of probably drafting legal documents, negotiating the deal. I don't know how far along it was, but for OpenAI to just shut it down sort of out of the blue after this deal was already in the works is probably pretty frustrating for Disney. And I think it highlights a good argument for Adobe. And it is something they've discussed as well, how Adobe has this track record of reliability that they can capitalize on, right? It wants to be the creative platform for enterprises to create content. And that reliability is really powerful, right? At this point, Disney might say, we still want to do this, but we want to work with someone that we can trust. And they might go to Adobe for that, who's just partnered with Runway AI, which is a video creation tool. So I do believe that does matter. How much? I'm not totally sure, but I think it's worth considering. And then the other thing they're discussing a lot is their agent orchestration and being that agentic platform for marketing departments at the enterprise level. And this is also a really difficult and interesting conversation because a lot of SaaS businesses are trying to do that now, right? Salesforce is trying to be the agent for your customer relationships. Microsoft is trying to be the central orchestration layer. And Adobe is really thinking about it as owning the customer experience part of the business, while there would be other agents that work on HR or finance or whatever. Again, this is really tough too because no one really knows how this is going to work out, right? Like, it might be the case that Microsoft's agent is able to do everything. It might be the case that Salesforce is the one that wins because they have the customer data, or maybe Salesforce is the better one for business-to-business relationships, but Adobe is the one for business-to-consumer relationships where there's more of a marketing angle rather than like a sales team angle. I don't know. It's really outside my realm of expertise, to be honest with you. But Adobe feels that this transition will happen faster than we all think about it might have to take in our head, because the capabilities of AI make it so that integration between the data models and everything that has to happen to build these capabilities is so much easier now. Okay, and then the last risk here is the one that I'm personally most worried about, and that is increased costs or reduced margins. Really, if we just take a step back here and you think about it logically, it's more difficult to decide what you have to do and then do it versus being told what to do and then doing it, right? And that's really the difference between AI that can think and make decisions versus traditional software, which is basically just a script of what to do. So because of that, in my head, AI is always going to be more expensive than traditional code. The question is really how much scaling compute and Moore's law is able to bring that cost down. And the timeline of that we'll discuss later, but regardless, I think in the short term, their cost of sales will increase pretty significantly because of the AI inference costs that they're needing to consume in order to provide their AI products. So here's where we're going to start to look at Q1 FY26. And we actually already touched on this in an earlier video in the series, but if you remember, the hosting and data center percent of growth cost increased 8% in FY25 compared to FY24, whereas in Q1 of FY26 compared to Q1 of FY25, it represented 14% of the growth. And when you do the math on this, the extrapolated impact of this, which is not necessarily going to be true, but it's just what the data is hinting, is basically a doubling of their data and cloud hosting costs because of AI inference. And that is really significant because it implies that Adobe cannot escape this any more than any other company can. And as they execute on their AI strategy, I would expect those inference costs to hit their margin. The only way they can sort of get around it is if they're able to pass those costs onto the customer. And honestly, we have seen in the past that Adobe does have pricing power. We talked about this in the last video. So ultimately, if we're just going off what's happened in the past and our understanding the moat, I think you would suspect that Adobe is able to push at least some of these costs onto the customer without losing them. But if AI costs are really that much higher than what Adobe's traditional cost basis is, I would say that they're not going to be able to push all of it. And then here on the costs, I think the opportunities are less of an opportunity because it's not really in Adobe's control, but if the AI layer commoditizes, which it very well might be, I feel like my opinion on this changes every single week, but if the AI landscape becomes one of model providers and platform distributors, and Adobe is able to be that creative AI platform because of all their proprietary tools and their high switching costs and their current and large install base, instead of charging Adobe high compute fees, they might actually have to compete with each other for distribution through Adobe's apps. And in that world, Adobe might actually get preferential pricing and could maybe provide a more competitive offer to customers than its competition like Canva or something like that. Again, I don't really feel like I have an answer for any of these that I'm very confident with. And I think that's one of the big risks with Adobe. I think looking at it in this way, I actually wouldn't say it helped me. I think it made me a little bit more confused. But I think in the last video of this series, we're gonna see it all come together when we actually build out the valuations and put some confidence levels on these threats and these opportunities. So for now, let's just summarize what we've talked about today. The first is that AI is this new technology and has spurred this influx of capital into creating competition for Adobe. The low-end consumer is the most valuable since they're okay with good enough art, and we're not really sure how much of Adobe's customer base this represents, but to be honest, we're not that worried about it because there was already cheaper substitutes before AI that I think a lot of that customer base has already migrated to. On the professional level, there's sort of really two risks. The first is the same as the low end, and that's that professionals leave the Adobe ecosystem. However, these professionals have those high switching costs, and as we talked about in earlier videos, educational institutions are still acting as like that feeder system for the professional skill set into Adobe products. Not to mention, as AI gets better, the bottleneck will probably just shift from content creation to content management, of which Adobe already has integrated solutions and makes it easy for them to be the solution to that problem, even if the pure content creation problem goes away. And then I think the other problem is like the pricing model and how they charge, but really I'm just not worried about that, because if agents remove humans from the organization, Adobe's tools still have cost advantages for agents to use them as MCP tools. And really, if they're providing all this value to enterprises, they have grounds to negotiate higher fees and continue to grow that way. The real question is on the execution and whether or not Adobe will be able to solidify itself as the AI agent layer for marketing against some of the other agentic software competitors. And then finally, even if things do go well for Adobe, does it threaten the cost structure of the business? Are they going to be able to maintain the 89% margins that we have gotten used to? The AI inference costs could easily expand in the short term, reducing that margin and ultimately restricting cash flow, which is what you are using to value the business in the first place. Longer term, it's probably not an issue. Moore's law will bring down those costs. Algorithmic improvements will make less compute needed in the first place. And Adobe does have some pricing power, so as long as they're able to execute on AI, they probably have some justification to increase prices. So that's the threats and opportunities covered. To be honest with you, this is the most difficult conversation out of all of them that we're gonna have. Hopefully you learned something. And if you wanna see the next two parts where we talk about the management team and then do a final evaluation on the business, make sure to subscribe, like the video, all that stuff, and I will see you next time. See ya.